The 10 Plagues of Egypt. A battle between God and Pharaoh. The night air was thick with the scent of the Nile, its waters stretching like a lifeline through Egypt. In the great palace, Pharaoh sat upon his golden throne, a god in his own eyes, ruling over the land with power and pride. Yet, far beyond the grandeur of his court, there was a people crying out in suffering, the Israelites, slaves who groaned under the weight of their oppression. For years, they had begged for freedom, but Pharaoh's heart was like stone. He would not let them go. And so, God sent Moses, a man raised in the Egyptian palace but chosen by the Almighty to lead his people to freedom. Moses and his brother Aaron stood before Pharaoh, their voices steady but firm. "The Lord, the God of Israel, says, 'Let my people go.'" Pharaoh scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Who is this God that I should obey him? The Israelites are mine. I will not let them go." Moses knew what was coming. God had warned him, Pharaoh's heart would be hardened. And so, the first plague struck. The first plague, water to blood. It began at the river. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, turned red as blood. The fishermen gasped as their nets came up filled with dead fish, their silver scales tainted with crimson. The people rushed to the banks, dipping their hands into the water, only to recoil in horror. The stench of decay filled the air. The river was no longer a source of life but a curse. For 7 days, there was no clean water in the land. Pharaoh's magicians performed tricks, mimicking the miracle, and Pharaoh remained unmoved. He waved his hand dismissively. "It is nothing. I will not let them go." The second plague, frogs everywhere. That night, a sound unlike any other filled the land, a chorus of croaks rising from the darkness. The frogs came in waves, spilling over the fields, leaping into homes, filling beds, kitchens, and even Pharaoh's palace. The queen screamed as she found them in her chambers, their slimy bodies hopping across her silk sheets. Servants ran wildly, trying to remove them, but there were too many. Pharaoh called for Moses, his face pale. "Pray to your God. Take them away, and I will let your people go." Moses prayed, and the frogs died. But as their bodies were gathered into piles, rotting in the sun, Pharaoh changed his mind. "I will not let them go." The third plague, swarms of gnats. Moses stretched out his staff, and the dust of the earth became gnats. Tiny, biting insects filled the air, crawling over people and animals. The Egyptians swatted at them, but there was no escape. The magicians tried to replicate the plague but failed. "This is the finger of God," they whispered in fear. But Pharaoh would not listen. The fourth plague, flies take over. Then came the flies, thick, buzzing swarms that blackened the sky, filled every home, and landed on food. They tormented the people but did not enter the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. Pharaoh, weary from the suffering, called for Moses. "Go. Worship your God, but do not leave Egypt." Moses shook his head. "We must go into the wilderness as the Lord commands." Pharaoh clenched his jaw. "Then no one will go." And so, the plague remained. The fifth plague, death of livestock. A deeper sorrow fell upon Egypt as the next plague came. Disease struck the animals. The cattle, the horses, the camels, and the sheep, one by one, they fell, their bodies lifeless in the fields. But in Goshen, not one animal of the Israelites died. Pharaoh sent men to check. They returned, trembling. The Israelites' animals live. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hard. The 6 plague boils on the skin. Without warning, painful boils erupted on the skin of the Egyptians. Even Pharaoh's magicians, who had once performed their own tricks, now sat covered in sores, unable to stand before Moses. The people mourned in pain, but Pharaoh's pride would not break. The 7th plague, hailstorm of fire. Then the sky darkened. Thunder rolled across the heavens as hailstones, mingled with fire, rained down upon Egypt. Fields were destroyed, trees shattered, and those caught outside were struck down. Pharaoh trembled at the might of this God. "I have sinned," he admitted. "Pray for me, and I will let your people go." Moses prayed, and the storm stopped. But once again, Pharaoh hardened his heart. The 8th plague, the locusts, come. A great wind rose from the east, carrying with it an army of locusts. They covered the land, devouring everything the hail had not destroyed. Pharaoh groaned in despair. "I have sinned against your God. Forgive me, and take this plague away." Moses prayed, and the locusts vanished. But Pharaoh went back on his word. The 9th plague, darkness, covers Egypt. Then, without warning, a deep darkness fell over the land. For 3 days, the Egyptians could not see one another. Their lamps would not burn, and fear gripped their hearts. But in Goshen, the Israelites had light. Pharaoh called for Moses. "Go. But leave your flocks and herds behind." Moses refused. Pharaoh's face twisted in anger. "Get out of my sight. If you see my face again, you will die." Moses stared at him. "You are right. You will never see my face again." The final plague, death of the firstborn. That night, a great silence hung over Egypt. Then, at midnight, a cry unlike any other filled the land. From the palace to the poorest home, the firstborn sons were struck down, including Pharaoh's own son. But in the homes of the Israelites, there was no death. They had obeyed God's command, marking their doors with the blood of a lamb. The angel of death had passed over them. Pharaoh, broken and weeping, called for Moses. His voice was hoarse with grief. "Go. Take your people and leave." And so, at last, after years of suffering, the Israelites walked free. The God of their fathers had delivered them with a mighty hand. And Pharaoh, who once thought himself a god, was left to watch as the people he had enslaved marched toward the promise of a new life. Subscribe to my channel for more Bible stories. Comment and share.